I watched in horror from my kitchen window as the bright orange construction equipment rolled onto the corner of my property, right where my grandmother's grave had rested peacefully for the past 43 years. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the tile floor, but I barely noticed. The HOA had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. My name is Benjamin Greene, and I've lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona for 15 years. I inherited the property from my parents, who bought it back in 1982 when this area was still considered rural, before developers turned it into cookie-cutter housing with their perfect lawns and ridiculous regulations. The house sat on 2 acres, grandfathered in before the HOA existed, which meant certain parts of my land weren't technically subject to their usual restrictions. At least, that's what I thought. My grandmother, Ruth Greene, died in 1982 at the age of 78. She'd lived on this property since 1960 in a small farmhouse that my parents eventually tore down and replaced with the current structure. When she passed, she'd made one simple request in her will: to be buried on the property she loved, under the old cottonwood tree near the eastern boundary. Back then, it was legal. Arizona law permitted home burials with proper permits and documentation, and my parents had done everything by the book. The grave was registered with Maricopa County, complete with a beautiful granite headstone that read, "Ruth Greene, 1904-1982, Forever Home." I sprinted out my back door, still in my pajama pants and undershirt, running barefoot across the dewy grass. It was barely 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in March 2025. The construction crew had 2 excavators and a steamroller, along with several workers in hard hats milling around with clipboards. "Stop! Stop right now!" I yelled, waving my arms as I ran toward them. "You can't dig here!" A burly man with a gray beard turned to face me, lowering his clipboard. "You the homeowner?" "Yes, I'm Benjamin Greene. This is my property, and you need to get off it immediately. There's a grave here, my grandmother's grave." He frowned and consulted his paperwork. "Sir, according to the permits we received from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is designated common area for the new wellness trail project. We've got all the authorization we need." "Common area? This is my land, and even if it were common area, which it isn't, there's a registered burial site right there." I pointed toward the cottonwood tree, where the headstone should have been visible. My stomach dropped. The headstone was gone. "Where's the headstone? There was a headstone right there." The foreman shifted uncomfortably. "We were told to remove some old landscaping features yesterday afternoon. Nobody said anything about a grave, sir. We just followed our work orders from the HOA." My hands were shaking with rage. "You removed a grave marker? That's desecration. That's illegal." "Look, buddy, I don't want any trouble. Take it up with your HOA. We're just contractors doing a job. If you've got a problem with the project, you need to call them." He handed me a business card with the construction company's information, then turned back to his crew. "All right, let's get started. We're already behind schedule." "If you move 1 more inch of dirt, I'm calling the police," I shouted. The foreman sighed heavily. "Sir, we have permits, legal permits. If you interfere with our work, you'll be the one in trouble. Now please step back behind the property line." I stood there, shaking with fury and disbelief, as one of the excavators rumbled to life. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" "Someone is desecrating my grandmother's grave. There's a construction crew on my property, and they've removed her headstone and are about to dig up her burial site." "Sir, is this an active crime in progress?" "Yes, they're about to destroy a registered grave site. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line and don't interfere with the workers." The police arrived within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulling up to the curb. Officers Martinez and Chen approached the scene, and I rushed to meet them, explaining everything as quickly as I could. Officer Martinez took notes while Officer Chen went to speak with the construction foreman. After about 15 minutes of back and forth, Martinez came over to me with a grim expression. "Mr. Greene, the construction company does have valid permits issued by your HOA. However, if there's truly a registered burial site here, that's a different matter entirely. We need to verify that information before we can order them to stop work." "I have all the documentation inside. My grandmother was buried here legally in 1982. It's registered with the county." "Can you provide those documents?" "Absolutely. Give me 5 minutes." I ran back inside, my heart pounding. I kept all the important family documents in a fireproof safe in my home office. I rifled through folders until I found the one labeled Grandmother Ruth. Inside were the burial permit, the death certificate, the property survey showing the grave location, and even the receipt from the monument company for the headstone. When I returned, both officers examined the documents carefully. Officer Chen made several phone calls to the county recorder's office while we waited. The construction crew had shut down their equipment and were standing around looking annoyed. Finally, Chen hung up and nodded to his partner. "It checks out. There's a registered burial site at these exact coordinates filed in 1982. This is a crime scene now." Officer Martinez immediately began cordoning off the area with yellow tape. "Nobody touches anything. We need to call in the county medical examiner's office and get someone from the sheriff's department out here. Mr. Greene, do you know where they removed the headstone to?" "I have no idea. They said they took it yesterday." The foreman overheard and called out, "We've got it in our truck. We were told it was just an old decorative stone. It's not damaged or anything." "We'll need to take possession of that as evidence," Martinez said. "This is now an investigation into unlawful disturbance of a burial site." Over the next few hours, my property became a hub of activity. The medical examiner arrived and carefully examined the area around the cottonwood tree. To my relief, they confirmed that the grave itself hadn't been disturbed yet, though the crew had been within inches of it when I stopped them. The headstone was retrieved from the construction company's truck, and I nearly cried with relief when I saw it was intact. By noon, a detective from the Scottsdale Police Department arrived. Detective Sarah Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She interviewed me, the construction crew, and examined all the documents. "Penny, Mr. Greene, I need to understand the full situation here. How did the HOA get permits to build on your property?" "I have no idea. This corner of my land has never been part of the HOA common area. My property was grandfathered in before the HOA existed." "Do you have a current property survey?" "Yes, from 2018 when I refinanced my mortgage." "I'll need to see that. I'm also going to need to speak with your HOA board. Do you know who's currently in charge?" "The president is Patricia Winters. She's been running the board like her personal kingdom for the past 8 years." Detective Morrison made notes. "I'll be in touch with her today. In the meantime, this construction site is shut down pending investigation. I'm recommending charges for unlawful disturbance of human remains against whoever authorized the removal of that headstone." As the detective left, I felt a small measure of satisfaction. But I knew this was just the beginning. Patricia Winters wasn't going to back down easily. That evening, I received a certified letter from the HOA legal team. I opened it with a sense of dread. "Dear Mr. Greene, it has come to our attention that you interfered with authorized construction on HOA common property this morning. As per the Meadowbrook Estates CC and RSE Section 4.7, all property within 10 feet of boundary lines is considered common area for maintenance and improvement purposes. The Wellness Trail project was approved by a majority vote of homeowners in January 2025. Your interference has cost the HOA thousands of dollars in construction delays. You are hereby fined $1,500, payable within 30 days. Additionally, you are required to attend a disciplinary hearing before the board on March 28th at 7 p.m. Failure to attend will result in additional fines and potential legal action. Sincerely, Patricia Winters, HOA President." I read the letter 3 times, my anger building with each pass. They were trying to gaslight me, claiming that my property was their common area. They were fining me for stopping them from desecrating my grandmother's grave. I immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb, who'd handled my refinancing in 2018. When I explained the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Ben, this is serious. If they've filed permits claiming that land is common area, we need to challenge that immediately. Your property survey clearly shows your boundaries, and there's no easement or common area designation on that corner. Do you still have your HOA documents from when you bought the place?" "I inherited it, but yes, I have all the original HOA incorporation documents from 1985. My property is specifically listed as grandfathered with different rules." "Perfect. Bring everything to my office tomorrow morning. We're going to bury them in paperwork, if you'll pardon the expression." The next morning, I met with Marcus for 3 hours. We went through every document, every survey, every piece of paper related to my property. The evidence was overwhelming. My land was not part of the HOA common area. The eastern boundary where my grandmother was buried was a full 20 feet inside my property line. So how did they get permits? I asked. Marcus frowned, studying the HOA's recent filing with the county. It looks like they submitted a fraudulent property survey. This survey here, the one they gave to the county for the construction permits, shows your property line 15 feet west of where it actually is. That would put your grandmother's grave on what appears to be common area. They falsified a survey? It appears that way. And if that's true, Patricia Winters and whoever else was involved in this could be facing criminal charges, fraud, forgery, possibly criminal desecration of a burial site. What do we do? First, I'm filing an emergency injunction to halt all construction indefinitely. Second, I'm sending a letter to the HOA's legal counsel informing them of the fraudulent survey and demanding a full audit of how this project was approved. Third, we're going to request a formal investigation by the county attorney's office. Will that fine hold up? Marcus laughed. Not a chance. In fact, you might want to consider a countersuit for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They tried to dig up your grandmother's grave, Ben. That's beyond the pale. Over the next week, things escalated rapidly. Marcus filed the injunction, and a judge granted it within 48 hours, officially shutting down the Wellness Trail project. The HOA's insurance company got involved, and suddenly their lawyers were scrambling to distance themselves from Patricia Winters' decisions. I started digging into the HOA's finances, which as a homeowner I had a right to review. What I found was shocking. The Wellness Trail project had a budget of $300,000, but when I cross-referenced it with the actual bids from construction companies, the real cost should have been around $150,000. Where was the other $150,000 going? I brought my findings to Detective Morrison, who was still investigating the grave desecration. Her eyes widened as she reviewed my documentation. Mr. Greene, I think you've uncovered something much bigger than we initially thought. This looks like embezzlement. I'm going to refer this to our financial crimes unit. The HOA disciplinary hearing on March 28th was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I showed up with Marcus, and we found the community center packed with neighbors. Word had spread about what happened, and people were angry. Not at me, but at the HOA board. Patricia Winters sat at the head table with 4 other board members, Treasurer Donald Kemper, Secretary Linda Hawthorne, and members at large Robert Price and Sharon Mitchell. Patricia was exactly what you'd expect. A woman in her late 50s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut, too much makeup, and an expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons. She banged her gavel as Marcus and I took our seats in the front row. This hearing will come to order. We're here to address the violations committed by Mr. Benjamin Greene on March 19th when he interfered with authorized HOA construction and made false claims about his property boundaries. Before she could continue, Marcus stood. Madam President, I'm Marcus Webb, attorney for Mr. Greene. Before we proceed, I need to inform this board that you are currently under investigation by the Scottsdale Police Department for multiple crimes, including filing a fraudulent property survey, unlawful disturbance of human remains, and possible embezzlement of HOA funds. My client will not be participating in this sham hearing. Instead, I'm serving you with this notice of intent to file a federal lawsuit against the HOA and all board members personally for violation of Mr. Greene's civil rights, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The room erupted. Neighbors started shouting questions at the board. Patricia's face turned bright red. "You can't sue us! We have immunity!" she shrieked. HOA board members have limited immunity for decisions made in good faith, Marcus replied calmly. Filing fraudulent documents and attempting to dig up a grave doesn't qualify as good faith. You're going to be personally liable for this mess. A man in the back stood up. Patricia, is it true? Did you fake a property survey? Of course not. This is all a misunderstanding. Then explain how your survey shows Mr. Greene's property line in a completely different place than the county's official survey, Marcus said, pulling out both documents and holding them up. These are publicly available records. Anyone can verify this. Another neighbor called out, "What about the missing money?" Someone posted on the community Facebook that there's $150,000 unaccounted for in the trail project. Patricia's composure was cracking. That's privileged financial information. No, it's not, I said, standing up. Every homeowner has the right to review HOA finances. I exercised that right, and I found massive discrepancies. The construction bids don't match the approved budget. Where did the extra money go, Patricia? Donald Kemper, the treasurer, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. He whispered something to Patricia, who shook her head violently. Then he stood up, his voice shaking. I can't do this anymore. I didn't sign up for this. He turned to face the crowd. Patricia created a shell company. The extra money in the budget was supposed to go to consulting fees for project management, but the consulting company is owned by her son-in-law. The room exploded with outrage. Sharon Mitchell, one of the other board members, stood up looking shocked. Donald, is that true? Yes, she told us it was normal that lots of HOAs use outside consultants. But when I looked into it more, I realized the company doesn't actually do anything. It's just a way to funnel money to her family. Patricia was screaming now. You have no proof. You're all going to be sued for slander. Marcus pulled out his phone and held it up. I'm recording this, and I'm sure others are too. Mrs. Winters, I strongly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel. You're going to need it. Within minutes, Patricia stormed out of the hearing room, followed by Linda Hawthorne. The remaining board members looked shell-shocked. Robert Price, a retired accountant, took control of the meeting. Folks, I think we need to adjourn this hearing and call an emergency board meeting. We also need to suspend Mrs. Winters from her duties pending a full investigation. The crowd applauded. As Marcus and I left, several neighbors came up to shake my hand and apologize for what I'd been through. Over the next few weeks, the dominoes fell rapidly. Detective Morrison's Financial Crimes Unit conducted a full audit of the HOA's books and found that Patricia had been embezzling money for years, not just from the trail project. Her son-in-law's consulting company had received over $400,000 in payments for services never rendered over a 5-year period. On April 15th, Patricia Winters was arrested at her home on charges of fraud, embezzlement, filing false documents, and unlawful disturbance of human remains. The arrest made the local news, and I watched with grim satisfaction as she was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence. Her son-in-law, Derek Foster, was arrested the same day for conspiracy and money laundering. Donald Kemper received immunity for his cooperation, but Linda Hawthorne, who had allegedly known about the scheme and stayed silent, was charged as an accomplice. The county attorney's office also filed charges against the surveying company that had produced the fraudulent property survey. It turned out they'd never actually visited my property. They'd just altered an old survey based on Patricia's instructions. The company's owner claimed he didn't know it would be used for construction permits, but the investigation revealed he'd been paid $10,000 under the table. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the aftermath on my property. The construction company had removed their equipment, but the area around my grandmother's grave was torn up from all the investigation activity. I hired a professional landscaping company to restore the ground around the cottonwood tree and reinstall the headstone properly. On a sunny morning in early May, I stood by the grave with my sister Rachel, who'd flown in from Portland when she heard what happened. I can't believe they tried to do this, she said softly, touching the headstone. Grandma Ruth would have been furious. She would have marched over to Patricia's house with her cane and given her what for, I said, smiling at the memory. Our grandmother had been a formidable woman, tough as nails from growing up during the Depression. What happens with the HOA now? They've installed a completely new board. Robert Price is the interim president, and they're implementing new oversight procedures. The residents voted to dissolve the Wellness Trail project entirely and use the remaining legitimate funds to repair some of the community's actual infrastructure issues. And your lawsuit? Marcus says we'll probably settle. The HOA's insurance company is desperate to make this go away. He's pushing for a significant payout, plus a permanent easement protecting this entire section of my property from any future HOA claims. Good. You deserve it after what they put you through. The civil lawsuit moved forward through May and June. The HOA's insurance company initially offered $50,000 to settle, which Marcus laughed at. We countersued for $2 million, citing emotional distress, legal fees, property damage, and punitive damages. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed even more disturbing details. Patricia had specifically targeted my property for the trail because she'd been trying to force me to sell for years. She thought if she could take a chunk of my land for community use, she could pressure me to move. Several emails between her and Linda Hawthorne discussed how much they hated having a non-conforming property in their perfect subdivision. In one particularly damning email, Patricia wrote, "I don't care if there's an old grave there. Nobody's visited it in years. We'll just move the headstone to a cemetery and tell him it's for the good of the community. If he makes a fuss, we'll fine him into submission." When Marcus showed me that email, I felt physically sick. The callousness, the complete disregard for both my rights and the memory of my grandmother was breathtaking. The criminal trial for Patricia Winters began in September 2025. I attended every day, wanting to see justice served. The prosecution laid out a damning case showing years of financial fraud and abuse of power. The attempted grave desecration was framed as the culmination of Patricia's belief that she was above the law. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she'd made mistakes in judgment, but hadn't intentionally committed crimes. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 weeks of testimony and only 4 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty on all counts. Patricia Winters was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $600,000 to the HOA. Her son-in-law Derek received 5 years. Linda Hawthorne pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received 2 years probation plus a $10,000 fine. The civil lawsuit settled in October. The HOA's insurance company agreed to pay $1.2 million, and the HOA itself voted to grant me a permanent conservation easement on the entire eastern acre of my property, ensuring no future board could ever claim it as common area. They also paid for a complete restoration of the land around my grandmother's grave, including a beautiful wrought iron fence to protect it. On a cool November morning, I stood by the newly protected gravesite with a bottle of my grandmother's favorite wine. The landscaping company had done beautiful work. Native Arizona plants surrounded the cottonwood tree, and the fence had a small gate with a bench inside where I could sit and visit. "I wish you were here to see this, Grandma," I said quietly, pouring a small amount of wine on the ground by her headstone, an old tradition she'd taught me. "You always said to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets. I did my best." The cottonwood tree's leaves rustled in the breeze, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice. "That's my boy." My phone rang. It was Robert Price, the new permanent HOA president. "Ben, I wanted to let you know the board just voted unanimously to name the new community park after your grandmother. We thought Ruth Greene Memorial Park would be appropriate, given everything that happened. We'd like to put a plaque there, explaining how she loved this land and why protecting homeowner rights matters." I was speechless for a moment. "Robert, that's very generous. Thank you." It's the least we can do. What Patricia did was inexcusable, and a lot of us feel terrible that we didn't catch it sooner. We want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. After we hung up, I sat on the bench inside the fence for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. The fight had been exhausting, expensive, and emotionally draining, but it had been worth it. My grandmother's final resting place was safe. A corrupt HOA president was in prison. The community had learned a hard lesson about the importance of oversight and accountability. And I'd learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means going to war with people who think they're untouchable. The settlement money was sitting in my bank account, more than I'd ever had at once. Marcus had already taken his portion for legal fees, which he'd more than earned. I'd been thinking about what to do with the rest. That evening, I drafted an email to the new HOA board with a proposal. I wanted to use half of the settlement to create a legal defense fund for homeowners in our community who faced unjust actions by future HOA boards. The fund would provide free legal consultation and, if necessary, representation for residents who couldn't afford to fight back against abuse of power. Robert called me the next morning, his voice excited. "Ben, the board loves your idea. We want to match your contribution to the legal defense fund. This could be a model for HOAs across the country. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I went through, I said. If my grandmother's grave hadn't been involved, if I hadn't had those old property documents, if I couldn't afford a lawyer, Patricia would have gotten away with it. You're right, and that's why this fund is so important. The Ruth Greene Legal Defense Fund was officially established in December 2025 with $200,000 in initial funding. The local news ran a story about it, and soon other communities were reaching out to ask how they could set up similar programs. I also used some of the settlement money to commission a proper historical marker for my grandmother's grave, working with a local historian to document her life. Ruth Greene had been a teacher, a mother of 4, a widow who'd raised her children alone during World War II, and a pillar of the community. Her story deserved to be told. The marker was installed in early January 2026, a beautiful bronze plaque on a stone base next to the cottonwood tree. It read, Ruth Greene, 1904-1982. Educator, mother, pioneer. She loved this land and fought for what was right. Her legacy of standing up for justice lives on. On the first anniversary of the construction crew's attempted destruction, March 19, 2026, I held a small memorial service by my grandmother's grave. My sister Rachel came, along with several cousins I hadn't seen in years. Robert Price and some of the new HOA board members attended, as did Detective Morrison and several neighbors who'd supported me throughout the ordeal. Marcus Webb gave a short speech about the importance of property rights and community accountability. What happened here was an attempt to erase history and steamroll over individual rights in the name of community improvement. But true community isn't about forcing everyone to conform. It's about respecting differences, protecting the vulnerable, and holding power accountable. Benjamin Greene did that, and we're all better for it. After the service, as people mingled and shared stories about my grandmother and the crazy year we'd all been through, I found myself standing with Rachel by the fence, looking at the grave. You know what's funny? She said. Grandma Ruth always hated bureaucrats and petty tyrants. Remember how she used to rail against the county officials who tried to tell her how to run her farm? I laughed. Oh, yeah. She once told a building inspector that she'd been raising chickens since before he was born and didn't need his permission to continue. He backed down pretty quick. She would have loved that you took down Patricia Winters. That's exactly the kind of fight she would have picked. I like to think I inherited her stubborn streak. You definitely did. As winter turned to spring in 2026, life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal, though it was a new normal. The HOA operated with much more transparency now. Board meetings were recorded and posted online, financial reports were issued monthly and reviewed by an independent auditor. And most importantly, there was a new culture of respect for homeowner rights. Patricia Winters' trial had been a wake-up call for the community. People started paying attention to what their HOA was doing, asking questions, demanding accountability. Several other Arizona HOAs reached out to ask how we'd implemented our reforms, and some adopted similar measures. I received occasional updates about Patricia from Detective Morrison. She was serving her sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, with her earliest possible release date in 2031. Her son-in-law Derek was at a minimum security facility and would be eligible for parole in 2028. Both had been ordered to repay their embezzlement, though the HOA's attorney said it was unlikely they'd recover most of the money. The fraudulent surveying company had lost its license and shut down. The owner pleaded guilty to fraud and received 3 years probation plus a $50,000 fine. In April 2026, I was contacted by a reporter from a national magazine who wanted to do a story about HOA abuse and my fight to protect my grandmother's grave. I agreed, hoping it might help other people facing similar situations. The article came out in June and went viral. Suddenly, I was getting calls from homeowners all over the country who were dealing with tyrannical HOA boards. Some stories were almost comically petty, like the woman who was fined for having the wrong shade of beige on her shutters. Others were heartbreaking, like the veteran who was being foreclosed on because he couldn't afford the special assessments for amenities he never used. I couldn't help everyone, But I connected people with resources, shared the template for our legal defense fund, and testified remotely at several state legislative hearings about HOA reform. By the summer of 2026, I'd become an unlikely advocate for homeowner rights. It wasn't something I'd ever planned or wanted, but it felt right. My grandmother had devoted her life to teaching and helping others. In a way, I was continuing her legacy. In July, I was invited to speak at a national conference on community association management in Denver. I almost didn't go, uncomfortable with the idea of public speaking. But Marcus convinced me. "You have a platform now, Ben. Use it. Tell your story, and maybe you'll prevent the next Patricia Winters from destroying someone else's life." So I went to Denver and gave a 20-minute speech to an audience of HOA board members, property managers, and homeowner advocates. I told them about my grandmother, about the day I watched construction equipment roll toward her grave, about the fight that followed and the reforms that came after. The lesson here isn't that all HOAs are bad, I concluded. It's that power without accountability always leads to abuse. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining property values and community standards, but they must operate with transparency, respect for individual rights, and proper oversight. If your board isn't doing those things, you need to fix it before someone gets hurt. Because someone will get hurt. It might not be as dramatic as digging up a grave, but it will happen, and when it does, you'll wish you'd acted sooner. The speech received a standing ovation, which surprised me. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own stories and ask for advice. I exchanged contact information with several HOA reform advocates and agreed to join a coalition working on model legislation for HOA governance. When I returned to Scottsdale, I felt energized in a way I hadn't in years. The trauma of the past 16 months had been real and painful, but something good had come from it. My grandmother's grave was protected, a corrupt official was in prison, and communities across the country were having important conversations about power and accountability. In August, the city of Scottsdale officially dedicated Ruth Greene Memorial Park. It was a small park, just a few acres with playground equipment, picnic tables, and a walking path. But it was beautiful. The dedication ceremony was well attended, and the mayor gave a speech about community values and standing up for what's right. The bronze plaque at the park entrance read, "Ruth Greene Memorial Park, dedicated to the memory of Ruth Greene, 1904-1982, and to the principle that community strength comes from respecting individual rights and holding leaders accountable. May we never forget that good governance requires eternal vigilance." I kept a photo of that plaque on my desk, next to a picture of my grandmother from the 1970s. She was standing in front of the cottonwood tree, smiling, her hand shading her eyes from the Arizona sun. She looked strong and content, exactly how I wanted to remember her. The holidays that year felt different. I'd always spent them quietly, but in 2026 I hosted a big family gathering for the first time in decades. Rachel came with her husband and kids, cousins drove in from New Mexico and California, and we filled my house with noise and laughter and life. On Christmas morning, after presents were opened and the kids were playing with their new toys, I slipped outside with a mug of coffee and walked over to my grandmother's grave. The wrought iron fence was decorated with a simple evergreen wreath, and frost sparkled on the grass. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," I said softly. "Thank you for teaching me to fight for what matters. I hope I made you proud." The cottonwood tree stood tall and bare in the winter sunshine, its branches reaching toward the bright blue Arizona sky. It had stood there for over a century, surviving droughts and storms and the encroachment of suburban development. Like my grandmother, it was a survivor. In January 2027, nearly 2 years after the construction crew had rolled onto my property, I received a letter from the Arizona State Legislature. They'd passed a new law, the Homeowner Protection Act, which implemented many of the reforms our community had pioneered. The law required HOAs to carry liability insurance, submit to regular independent audits, allow homeowner review of all financial records, and establish dispute resolution procedures before fines could be levied. The letter thanked me for my advocacy and invited me to the signing ceremony. I attended with Marcus, and we watched as the governor signed the bill into law. Several legislators came over to shake my hand and tell me how much my testimony had helped push the legislation through. "You've changed things for hundreds of thousands of homeowners," one senator told me. "This law will prevent countless abuses of power." Driving home that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It had started with a moment of horror, watching construction equipment approach my grandmother's grave. It had continued through months of legal battles, investigations, and trials. And it had culminated in real, meaningful change that would protect people I'd never meet from abuses they'd never experience. That night, I wrote a long email to my sister, telling her about the signing ceremony and reflecting on everything that had happened. "I know you think I've become obsessed with this," I wrote, "but I can't help feeling like it's my purpose now. Grandma Ruth spent her life teaching and helping people. Maybe this is how I'm supposed to do the same thing. The money from the settlement won't last forever, but if I'm careful, I can dedicate the next few years to this work. What do you think?" Rachel's response came the next morning. "You already know what I think. Do it. Grandma would be so proud of you. I'm proud of you. Just make sure you take care of yourself too. You can't help anyone if you burn out." She was right, of course. I'd been running on adrenaline and righteous anger for so long that I'd neglected my own well-being. I started seeing a therapist to process the trauma of the past 2 years. I joined a gym and started taking better care of my health. I made time for friends and hobbies, not just HOA reform work. But I also leaned into the advocacy because it mattered. I helped establish similar legal defense funds in 3 other states. I consulted with homeowners facing foreclosure over unjust fines. I testified at legislative hearings in Nevada, Colorado, and Texas. I wrote op-eds and gave interviews and slowly built a network of people who cared about these issues. In March 2027, on what I'd started thinking of as the anniversary of my grandmother's attempted desecration, I held another memorial service by her grave. It had become an annual tradition, a way to remember what we'd fought for and why it mattered. This year, the crowd was larger. In addition to family and friends, there were homeowners I'd helped, advocates I'd met, and even a few journalists covering the event. Robert Price gave a speech about how far the community had come in 2 years. Marcus talked about the legal precedents we'd set, and I spoke about my grandmother and the values she'd instilled in me. Ruth Greene was an ordinary person who believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard, I said, standing by her grave with the cottonwood tree rustling overhead. She taught me that you don't have to be wealthy or powerful to make a difference. You just have to be willing to stand up and fight when something matters. 2 years ago, I had to fight to protect her resting place. But that fight became about something bigger, protecting everyone's rights, holding power accountable, and building communities based on respect rather than fear. That's her legacy, and it's a legacy I'm honored to carry forward. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, I stayed behind, sitting on the bench inside the fence. The settlement money had allowed me to take time off from my engineering job, and I'd decided not to go back. Instead, I was going to dedicate myself full-time to homeowner advocacy. It was risky, but it felt right. My phone buzzed with a text from a homeowner in Florida who'd been following my work. "Ben, our HOA just foreclosed on a disabled veteran for unpaid fines. He painted his door the wrong color while he was deployed and didn't see the notices. They're kicking him out of his home. Can you help?" I sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of purpose. This was the work now. This was how I honored my grandmother's memory and made sure her grave hadn't almost been destroyed for nothing. "Send me everything you have," I texted back. "We'll figure this out." I looked up at the cottonwood tree, at the headstone with my grandmother's name, at the fence that now protected this sacred ground. Patricia Winters had tried to pave over all of this for a jogging path, believing that her vision of community improvement mattered more than history, memory, or individual rights. She'd been wrong, and I'd spent 2 years proving it, not just for my grandmother, but for everyone who'd ever been bullied by a petty tyrant with a little bit of power. The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, the kind of sunset my grandmother had loved. I finished my coffee, locked the gate behind me, and walked back to my house. There was work to do, people to help, fights to fight. My grandmother had taught me that standing up for what's right wasn't a one-time thing. It was a way of life, a constant vigilance against those who would abuse power and trample on others, and as long as I had breath in my body and fight in my spirit, I'd keep doing it. For her. For the homeowners being crushed by unjust HOAs. For the principle that our homes should be our sanctuaries, not battlegrounds where petty officials wage war on our dignity and rights. Patricia Winters had thought she could pave over my grandmother's grave without consequences. Instead, she'd awakened something in me that would spend years making sure no other Patricia Winters could do the same thing to someone else. Justice had been served. The project was shut down. The criminals were in prison. The reforms were in place. And my grandmother rested peacefully under her cottonwood tree, her grave protected by law and by the love of those who remembered what she stood for. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.